All right, welcome everyone. My name is Charles Briggs. I'm the co-director of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, which is part of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, and I'm very pleased to welcome you virtual folks, as well as those who are embodied with us. I'm asking the audience, that is those of us who are here, to please turn off cell phones or anything that would make noise in the middle of the presentation. I start by acknowledging that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Quechua Ohlone. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited from and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with the avowed university values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Indigenous peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm, albeit somewhat weakly, Indigenous sovereignty and our commitment to hold the university more accountable to the needs of Indigenous American Indian people today. So it's great to be able to welcome you to a talk entitled Mass Incarceration and 21st Century Eugenics, sponsored by the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine and co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Law and Society, Diversity and Health Disparities Cluster of the Othering and Belonging Institute, and the Center for Race and Gender, in whose room we are actually physically located at this moment, and of whom I'm very proud to be an affiliate. And as always, to Deborah Lustig, who made not only this event possible, but the continuing existence of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine possible, and to Stephen Small for his leadership in ISSI. Professor James, who I will introduce in a moment, will speak to you for around 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. We welcome those of you joining us via Zoom to also join in the question and answer. You will see the Q&A feature, and please use that to pose your questions, and then, well, sorry about that, I will voice them on your behalf. I guess business as usual. Now, Jennifer James is an assistant professor in the Institute for Health and Aging and the Bioethics program at UC San Francisco, and also an affiliate of our Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. She is a sociologist and Black feminist scholar whose research lies at the intersection of race, gender, and health. Professor James is a qualitative researcher whose work centers on the lived experiences of those left at the margins of research and biomedicine. Her work is informed by her background in social work and policy. Her many publications include articles in the Journal of Medical Humanities, the International Journal of Prison Health, New Genetics and Society, and the American Journal of Bioethics. Her current research is focused on the ways the correction system intersects with the healthcare system and how health inequalities may be produced and reproduced for women facing serious and chronic illnesses. Today, she will share her community-based research on the forced sterilizations that occurred in California women's prisons. Welcome, Professor James. Glad to have you.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here. This talk was originally scheduled for the fall when we ended up having the graduate student worker strike, which I don't know. I'm curious to hear what everyone thinks about the outcomes of that strike, but I'm glad we were able to reschedule and be here in person and over Zoom. I hope everyone on Zoom can hear okay, but if you can't, I hope there's a way to virtually wave something so you can tell me to speak more loudly. So I'm so glad to be here today and share a little bit about this work we've been doing. And as a true qualitative researcher, I'm going to start by telling you a story. Oh, wow, I can see my slides there and there, so hopefully it works okay to go in both directions. So I'm going to tell you the story of a woman that I'm calling Moonbeam. So Moonbeam is a Native American woman. She's now in her 50s, and she was recently released after serving more than 25 years in a state prison in California. She lives with her parents. She helps care for her mom, who has dementia. The room she stays in at her parents' house is actually the room where her son stayed while she was incarcerated. He lived with her parents while she was inside, and he died really tragically during her incarceration. So Moonbeam told me the story of going to see a quite notorious doctor in the California prison system. I'm not naming him because usually in qualitative research, we don't name the people talk about, but if you've learned anything, know anything about sterilizations and you see a name of a doctor, this is who it is. So you can figure it out pretty easily. So she went to see this doctor to have a pap smear. She wasn't having any symptoms. She wasn't having any problems. The doctor said he wanted her to get scanned to check on something. She agreed to it. He tells her that she had 2 growths that could potentially turn into cancer and she should have them removed. And that's a scary prospect. So she agreed to have them removed. She goes to the hospital to have this procedure. She's handed the consent form to sign. No one reviews it. No one goes over it with her, talks about the procedure with her. And so she signs it, right? And she said, I agreed to the procedure. I agreed to them removing the growths. I never read the paperwork. I'm thinking this is the doctor. He works for the state of California. They hired somebody legit. Well, it wasn't. He wasn't. So after the surgery, she's recovering and she recalls that she just had puddles of sweat. She said it soaked in my neck, in between my breasts, dripping down my face. I'm in puddles of sweat. And she couldn't figure out what was going on. She figured it had something to do with the surgery. Several days later, she's back at the prison. She goes to have her dressings changed. Slides are moving. Sorry, they look really similar, but I'm a couple slides in. Yeah, so that's the next one. So she asked the nurse, what happened? What was done? Why am I sweating this much? I'm young. What's going on? And she's like, oh, you had a full hysterectomy. And she said, excuse me? And she said, the nurse said, you had a full hysterectomy. And Moonbeam had no idea. So a few days later, she saw the doctor. This is the same one who recommended the scans, recommended the surgery to remove the growths. And she described having this exchange with him. She said, you said I had 2 growths. You took everything out. And she described him sort of sitting back, looking pretty smug in his chair. And he goes, let me tell you something. I'm tired of you pretty girls coming to prison. You get out, you have sex with God knows whoever, and you come back to prison and you're pregnant. You have these babies that end up in the system and we have to pay taxes for them. And she said, my mouth just hit the floor, which same. So she said, I was so shocked I couldn't even answer. As it went on, I was thinking to myself, well, shoot, there's nothing I can do. And it came to me that this man just played God with my life. He took the choice whether I could have kids or not away from me without even asking. And so for a long time, I walked around thinking, damn, this guy got away with it. I'm in the system. What can I do? And she talked about what this meant to her specifically as a Native woman. And she said, when women, as Native women, were connected to Mother Earth, we're the only life givers. What gave him the right to take away my ability to give life? So difficult story, horrible story to hear. And I think, with this talk, with our time together, I want to talk about 2 big things. And so the first is I want to talk about some of what to me feel like quite eugenic practices happening in prisons today in the modern era, these sort of sterilizations, the way the sterilizations crop up and sort of keep cropping up despite legislation and lawsuits that have been aimed at stopping these practices, and talk about all the ways in which that's present today. But second, and maybe my larger objective, is to really think about how these sterilizations, these women having these procedures, not knowing what's going on, feeling like people are playing God with their reproductive organs, is in some ways the tip of the iceberg. These sterilizations that happened quite famously are a visible and despicable enactment of the ways in which prisons and state violence continue to enact, the ways in which prisons continue to enact state violence, and the different forms of eugenics and reproductive control that sort of lurk beneath the surface and are constantly present in the way we think about incarceration. So I want to consider the eugenic potential, reality, and intent of mass incarceration. But to do that, I have to trace 17 different histories together a little bit to try to get to this present moment. So let's go way, way back, early colonialism in the United States. So thinking about the family as a tool of state control. So the family, nuclear family as a thing, has been a core feature in US society for a very long time. And I think it was really established to protect whiteness and to protect wealth. It was formed in opposition to many and has been out of the reach of many. And I think in a lot of ways, while we think of it as a protective tool, a way of organizing society, sometimes we think of it as something benign and inherent, it can really serve as a site of state violence for those who live outside of what's considered normative. Throughout US history, BIPOC, disabled folks, impoverished folks, their reproduction and children have continued to be under the purview of the state, right? So thinking about slavery specifically, if we think about the category of family, during slavery, it was really defined for slave owners, not for enslaved people. We really changed how we organize family, how we think about lineage and heredity, to make sure that when children were fathered by free white men with enslaved women, they would still be enslaved, right? So family was no longer automatically passed through the father. It shifted, and it passed through the person who was enslaved in order to create and maintain the system. Black children were not kin, they weren't family, they were property, and enslaved people were coupled for reproductive increase and for profit. So family formations were forced as a way to increase profit for white slave owners, but not recognized and not kept together and not given autonomy over your children and the things that we think of when we think of family. So Black women were marked as monstrous and grotesque in order to justify enslavement. And we can think about this goes in all these other directions related to reproductive control and reproductive health. The idea of Black women not feeling pain, the experimentation that happened on Black enslaved women to advance obstetrics and gynecology, and all of this served as justification for reproductive oppression and control. But we can see this in many, many ways in lots of areas. Whoops. Thought this was all going to pop up one by one, and they didn't, so I apologize. The person on the screen, I had to click like 6 times. But anyway, we think about slavery, we think about residential schools, boarding schools for Native folks happening here and in Canada. We can think about segregation and the way that kept people apart to try to control who was reproducing with whom. Of course, immigration policies, which we see very much today, it's family separation at the border. We can think about institutionalization of different people who we saw unfit to be members of our society. And then, of course, we can think about eugenics. And the role that has played in helping organize who can reproduce and for what aim, and what's considered positive and negative. So the next sort of history I'm tracing a little bit is the eugenics movement. So eugenics is a field dedicated to arranging human reproduction so that the most desirable characteristics are passed on. There's many, many ways that this has been done over time. The one we think about a lot, the sort of famous one, involves forcibly sterilizing folks, so that some people could not have children. But we also think about all the positive eugenics. There were fairs that happened, encouraging people to breed together, healthy, fit family competitions, the idea of what a perfect, good family who should be having more babies is, and those who should not be having children. And of course, famously, eugenics got, a huge increase in start in the US and was really taken up around the world, and of course by the Nazis, with the idea that this was a great way to determine who and how we should organize reproduction. So across the US in the 20th century, 30 states had compulsory sterilization laws, and from 1907, 1909 up through the 60s, more than 60,000 people were sterilized in the US. California had the most far-reaching of these programs. Between 1909 and 1979, when it officially ended, more than 20,000 people were sterilized in California. And all of these numbers are kind of just guesses from conversations I've had with folks who've done a lot of research on it. We only know what's documented, right? We don't know what might not have been documented and all these different things. So it's very possible these numbers are larger than we know. And so what's important is that eugenics has long been linked to incarceration and the criminal legal system from the very start. So one of the most famous cases, Buck v. Bell, which sort of set the precedence around compulsory sterilization laws being legal in our country. It's funny, I was just talking to a lawyer about this right before this conversation, about this question of, was Buck v. Bell ever overturned? Nobody knows. It's this magical thing. Some people think it was, some people think it wasn't. But the justice in this case sort of famously said, it's better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve within facility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. So 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, right? So right from the start, sort of cementing into law, into precedents, that there's a link between criminality and heritability, or that we could stop criminality in the future by preventing people from reproducing, right? And of course, what happened to Carrie Buck was abhorrent. She was 18 years old. She was labeled as feeble-minded, as many folks were at the time for a lot of different reasons. She was accused of being pregnant because of immorality. It turned out that wasn't true. She was pregnant after assault. But the point is that this idea that there are certain people who shouldn't have babies and that we have a right to control that has been quite prevalent. So again, California's eugenics program that ran in the mid-20th century, most of the sterilizations took place at state institutions, state hospitals. Some of the most famous include Sonoma State Home, Pacific Colony, Napa State Hospital. We can see on this map sort of really all over the states they were taking place. Slowly, these facilities began to close. They changed focus. I mean, that's a whole other talk, is our history of these types of institutions and what that's changed and what that's meant. And the rate of sterilization dropped really dramatically in the 60s and 70s. But forcible sterilizations never stopped in California. That's the running theme we'll keep coming back to. In the 60s and 70s, more than 200 women, I think the number I've seen is 240, mostly Latina women, many who do not speak English, were sterilized in LA County. A group of survivors came forward and sued a case in 1978, Madrigal v. Quilligan. It was featured in a documentary, No Mas Bebés, that came out, gosh, 8-10 years ago now, about their fight and their sterilization, many of, not consent, not documented, not in language. This right here, I'm trying to show with my cursor. Right here is a memorial that opened recently at LA County. It's called Sobrevivir, or Survivor, and sort of memorializing what happened. And this was a huge activism around this on behalf of these women, standing up for what happened to them. And really, this coming to light, the lawsuit, reminded folks in the legislature that it was still illegal. We had not officially ended our eugenics program. So partially in response and with gratitude to those women, in 1979, the California eugenics law was officially repealed. So the law that made it legal to compulsorily sterilize people in state institutions, even though this was a county institution. So moving forward, in 2003, the governor at the time, Gray Davis, officially apologized to eugenic sterilizations. So this is the early 2000s. And, I've been really trying to understand the legal landscape of what was going on here, and it's pretty messy. So 1979, the state ended its eugenics law, compulsory sterilization law. Also in the late 70s, federally, it became illegal to use federal dollars to sterilize people in institutions without their consent. But what was legal and what was not in terms of people who are currently institutionalized or incarcerated at this time was really messy. If people receiving tubal ligations in state institutions were supposed to have high levels of approval, it was supposed to sort of work their way up in order to make sure it was medically necessary before these procedures happened. But from what we know, that wasn't necessarily being followed. And so at the same time, this is a graph from Nicole Novak, who does a lot of research on eugenics era sterilizations. We saw this drop in mental hospital rates in these sort of state homes and state institutions. At the same time, we sort of saw this sharp rise in incarceration, right? This is California specifically, but we see this trend nationally everywhere, that we continued, and we have always institutionalized people in this country and in this state specifically, but who they are and how and why we justified that shifted. So little history then, my third history, I think this is the last history I'm tracing, which is mass incarceration. So folks are probably familiar with, there's been a lot of attention around the idea of mass incarceration, which is great over the last couple decades, more and more. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, that came out, I don't even know how many, 15 years ago now? It's been a while, I can't remember. The documentary 13th, both of which sort of really argue that when the 13th Amendment was ratified and ended slavery in the US, an exception was made, right? Except as punishment for crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted. So there's been this argument that we sort of stopped enslaving people, but kept this loophole where we could keep people, have them work for free, and have them detained as long as they've been convicted of a crime. So many people have argued that we can sort of look at this across, the history of America. We went from sort of slavery to the Jim Crow era and really right into mass incarceration. So continually finding ways to control certain bodies, Black bodies, but I think also brown bodies and poor bodies and other types of bodies that we talk about really deliberately and quite, very explicitly based on race. And I think probably given whose room we're in and where we are at Berkeley, it doesn't need to be, I don't need to make the point too strongly, but this was really explicitly about race. It was intentionally racist from the start. So this is a quote from someone who worked in the Nixon administration, really saying, what the war on drugs was really all about. Nixon had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin and criminalizing both, we could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings. So it was always the sort of war on drugs, which is really a famous catalyst for the rise in incarceration, was explicitly targeting certain groups of people and explicitly racist in its intent. And it was incredibly successful, if that's your metric, is how many people were incarcerated. So we went from incarcerating, 350,000 people in 1970 to sort of at our peak in the early 2010s, more than 2 million people being incarcerated. It happened in a bipartisan way, policies that sort of, across different administrations to massively increase the number of people that we incarcerate. Luckily, we've seen a drop in the last few years since COVID. We'll see if that maintains, especially. But yeah, we obviously, we incarcerate more than anybody else in the entire world, sort of per capita and in numbers. We are very, very good at incarcerating people for very long periods of time. Things like 3 strikes laws, things like obviously mandatory minimums have really increased it. But something that I've been really interested in thinking about is what are all the forms of work that incarceration is doing in our society, right? Why do we incarcerate so many people? And I draw a lot on Angela Davis's work and Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work and thinking about this and thinking about their sort of arguments. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about California prisons as a geographical solution to socioeconomic problems, right? All the ways it creates jobs, that it takes people out of the job market, it creates jobs for other people, especially in areas where there aren't a lot of other industries happening. We can think about things like the rhetoric about jails as the largest mental health providers, the way that jails and prison become a part of our safety net, the way that we are able to give and receive services to people we otherwise don't give those services to. And then of course, Angela Davis talking about prisons making us feel safer, right? They make us think our own rights and liberties are more secure than they would be if prisons don't exist. So there's all these ways that prisons have become so enmeshed in our society. We can't imagine another possibility. When people talk about prison abolition, we can't even comprehend what that could mean, because the idea is so ingrained that there are certain people who are dangerous and bad that we need to be protected from, and this is the only way to do it, and this is the only way to help certain types of people as well, right? It comes from sort of a quote-unquote benevolent idea. This is the only way to help people who have certain types of illnesses or disabilities or whatever ways make them unable to function in our society. But what I've been really interested in thinking about is the way that prisons have created this new sort of underclass of people, right? We have all these labels we use, words that I don't use, but many, many people do, to refer to people who are incarcerate people. And I think about that in order to incarcerate someone, in order to literally, lock people in a cage, both quite literally, put someone, if we think about solitary confinement, in a room by themselves for decades at a time, something which nowhere else in the world, almost nowhere else in the world, do they allow such treatment to happen for this kind of extended amount of time. In order to do that, much like in order to enslave people, we have to have a fundamental transformation in how we view those people, right? I can't see someone as human or as like me and think it makes sense to lock them in a cage and treat them poorly for decades, right? Throw away the key. And so prisons and the criminal legal system more broadly have created this new idea, this new class of people, the criminal, the convict, the felon, who's bad and distant and different from us, who's deserving of punishment, not the least of which is loss of a lot of fundamental rights, right? Loss of the right to move, loss of the right to vote, loss of the right, we'll talk about loss of reproductive rights. And when we accept that this idea of criminals who both exist and that it being somewhat inherent, that it being deserving of punishment, it's not really that hard to make the leap to think maybe those people shouldn't have children. If you're so dangerous that you should be locked in a cage and away from us, is it weird to think you shouldn't raise children or be around children or give birth to children? And then prisons are sort of able to enact this in a lot of forms. And what I think about a lot is if we think about who we incarcerate, right? We incarcerate people with disabilities at massively higher rates than people who don't have disabilities. Obviously, people know the statistic of 1 in 3 Black men, lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, but Black and Latinx folks and Native folks who aren't on this incarcerated at much higher rates than white folks. Queer people incarcerated at much, much higher rates. I think this red bar over here, a Black trans person has an almost 50% lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. This is, let's see, annual income. So poor people, we incarcerate at much, much higher rates. They stay incarcerated longer because if you're or you can't bail yourself out of jail. So these are all the people that we've sort of as a society not liked for a really long time. And a lot of them are groups we put in additional protections for. It's not legal for me not to hire you because you're Black. It's not legal for me to fire you because you have a disability. It's not legal for me not to offer you housing for this and that reason. But it is legal for me to do all those things if you've been convicted of a crime. I am both legally and socially, in a lot of allowed to be afraid of you or to not like you or to treat you differently or not give you access to rights and resources. I can't ever remember the number of rights that you lose when you've been convicted of a felony, but it's a massively huge number of rights the rest of us are afforded. So because we sort of done this like transformational work, right? We've created this thing where it's not that you're Black, it's not that you're disabled, it's not that you're brown, it's not that you're queer, it's that you're a criminal. I'm now, sorry, I went backwards. Sorry, I went backwards just a second, but I'm back. I'm allowed to treat you differently, and I'm allowed to treat you differently in the ways that I've always treated you differently that used to be legal in our society. And so if we go back to this idea of like mental health rates dropping, imprisonment rising, it's not exactly the same group of people, but I think it's important to highlight that these are quite similar, right? A lot of the people we institutionalize, it's not just that these are people who would similarly now be in psychiatric institutions. Some of them are, and those people are much more likely to be in prisons and jails, but it's also people who were sexually deviant, right? It's also people who were feeble-minded, which wasn't, isn't a diagnosis that necessarily carries weight. It's people who, who were criminal in a lot of ways, a lot of petty crime. A lot of the types of people we institutionalize are the same. We've shifted where and why and the rationale we do this for. And so coming back to reproductive rights, I think it's important that this othering and reproductive control have always been a part of incarcerating women in the US from the very beginning of incarcerating women in the US. And I should say, I'm talking about women because prisons and jails are very sex segregated, and that's the language that's used. But there's always the people who aren't women incarcerated in women's facilities. But I'm mostly talking about people incarcerated in women's prisons, which of course includes trans men and non-binary folks. So Sarah Haley's work, No Mercy Here, she looks at this gender and punishment in the making of Jim Crow. So looking at prisons and jails and incarceration at the end of slavery and the beginning of Jim Crow era, and talks about Black women being incarcerated because they were threats to society, because of our unruly carnal impulses, our perverse mothering reproduced a class of Black and mulatto criminals that threaten the sanctity of the household and the safety of white women specifically. So Black women always being a risk and to white women, especially because of the way and the incorrect way, according to a lot of people, we parent and raise Black men, and incarceration serving as a tool to protect white women from this threat, right? So convicted labor camps served as a way to punish Black women who were deviant, to uphold white femininity, and contrast to Black deviance and lack of femininity, so we could have the white woman as good versus the criminal Black woman as bad. And this was always sort of a feature, always a reason we incarcerated Black women was because of their reproductive threat, as well as reproductive potential. Seeing them as monstrous in many ways. And I've just been reading more and more recently about Black women being incarcerated, being raped inside, getting pregnant, and those kids then becoming wards of the state who could then be sold back into slavery or sold in other ways. So this has always been a key feature. So let's come back to the present, right? So we've been at this place, the eugenics era had ended, mass incarceration was on the rise. We'd apologize for forcibly sterilizing people, but we continue to have this need, this desire to control reproduction, right? There's so many ways that's done, but one of those ways has been through incarceration. So it came out in the 2000s that California prisons were sterilizing patients. So in 2008, an organization called Justice Now learned that tubal ligations were being performed inside state prisons. This was a procedure that wasn't supposed to be happening. There was policy from the California Department of Corrections under a federal receivership, which we put in place because of medically negligent care, that this was a procedure that wasn't supposed to be allowed because it's not medically necessary. Yeah.
And you zoomed through a lot of history, and we're getting a request from someone on Zoom. Yeah. You can slow down just a little bit.
Happy to slow down. Thank you for saying it. I'm like so nervous about getting through all my content. Yeah, I'll slow down. So, all right, just to recap the history. Slavery, it was bad. It was about reproductive control. Eugenics era was bad. It was about reproductive control. Mass incarceration was bad. And now we're going to talk about how that was about reproductive control. And all of these things feed together and work together really well. So we're up to the 2000s in California. Organization Justice Now learns that tubal ligations are happening inside. They worked with a reporter from the Center for Investigative Reporting, Corey Johnson, who put out an article in 2013 alleging that 148 women received tubal ligations without proper consent while incarcerated inside state prisons. So this it sort of was a bombshell. People didn't realize this was still happening. It disrupted a lot, caused a flurry of media and of state investigations and a lot of things going on. And this reporter, Corey Johnson, he interviewed a provider who was involved in this, Dr. Heinrich, who was asked about the money the state was paying. So the state paid, $150,000 to doctors and outside hospitals to perform these tubal ligations on this procedure they weren't supposed to be doing. And asking about the money, Dr. Heinrich said, over a 10-year period, this isn't a huge amount of money compared to what you save in welfare paying for these unwanted children as they procreate more. So I think, to me, very clearly eugenic rhetoric, the idea that the state is going to be on the hook to pay for these children that shouldn't be had, that we have a right to control reproduction, the state does, rather than allowing for more indigent children to exist. And I think it's important to highlight this because looking back, a lot of people at the time said we didn't know it was illegal. They say we want to protect the autonomy of our patients wanted this procedure. They should have a right to have a tubal ligation if they want, which I agree with as a thing. And I think it's an important topic and it is very complex. And I think there may be some people who perform sterilizing procedures for their patients, for to do what they thought their patient wanted. But it's also, to me, very clear that there were actors in this who didn't think that people who were incarcerated should be having any more babies and made decisions based on that, right? And so I think of this as being quite eugenic, not necessarily because it's based on the idea that criminality is passed down or hereditary, but because it's clear that there's an idea that certain people shouldn't be reproducing and shouldn't have that right to do it, and that the state or doctors should be able to make that decision. So this came out in 2013. The state did an audit to corroborate if this was happening or not. And so this is from that audit. It shows the number of medical procedures happening in sterilization. And I think that this is the number, this 144, if you click one time on Zoom, it'll highlight it in red, the tubal ligations that were happening. And this gets a lot of attention because it was a procedure that wasn't supposed to be happening. It is explicitly for the purposes of sterilization. Tubal ligations were very famously done for the purposes of sterilization and reproductive control. What I think is also really important, gets less attention, is that there were 794 people who had a sterilizing procedure during this same period of time, right? And this period of time was only fiscal year 2005, 2006 through 2012, 2013. So I don't know, fiscal years really confuse me. That's like 6 years, something like that. Who knows? And the reason I raise this, so a few things. So one, I think we think about the 144, and I think it's important to remember that is abhorrent and bad, but doesn't tell the whole story. And that what we don't know, or what I've been interested in understanding, is all of these other procedures that happened, which go back to the story I started with, Moonbeam's story. She didn't have a tubal ligation, right? She had a hysterectomy for ostensibly because she had cancer, maybe, but she didn't, and she didn't know if she was consenting to it. How does she fit in, what happened to her, in this narrative about forced sterilizations? How do we consider the hundreds of other procedures that happened during this period, let alone the decades before and the decades since this happened, that still had the effect of sterilizing people and limiting their reproductive control, right? So I want to go through a few more examples of what was happening in California and how people talked about this. So first, I want to just sort of highlight that this was a thing that people inside knew was going on. So this is somebody talking about, she'd been in jail for like 6 years before she was incarcerated, which is like horrific, before she went to state prison, which is a very long time to be in jail. So she knew a lot of people in the state prison by the time she got there, because she'd seen so many folks come through. And she said, as soon as I got there to the prison, folks was warning me, what was going on, what was happening, in a way that was like, protect your uterus, That's when I first became aware of it. But I still didn't understand what it meant to be sterilized. So she's doing, like, the word on the street was the institution might be trying to take your uterus, watch out, which to me talks about how widespread it is, that this is the thing people are talking about. But as she alluded to, people still might not know that they were sterilized. So this is somebody else saying, as you know, people might not have even known. One thing I know inside, a lot of women are not educated about their health. I think it was the same person. It could have been someone else who said something like, when I got to prison, I didn't even know what a dang ovary was, right? She didn't know this term. A lot of people who we incarcerate, we target people who are poor, who are marginalized in a lot of ways, didn't have access to healthcare before, so might not have this knowledge. So she's saying, you know, they never went to the doctor when they were home, they weren't educated in there. And she said it was like a cattle call. You pushed through, you went through the doors and you took whatever you got. So people went in, they were told they needed a procedure and they said yes to it, not necessarily knowing what it meant. You know, if you don't know what an ovary is, do you know what it means to have a nephrectomy? Not knowing what it meant, not knowing the implications, and not knowing if they had another choice. And this extends to all kinds of medical care. I hear really similar language and similar stories, and people are talking about treatment for their blood pressure or for the cancer or whatever. But I think for a lot of folks, it feels like there's specific implications when people are making sort of irreversible decisions about their reproductive health without having that understanding of what it meant. So one story is someone who asked us to call her Goose. So Goose was incarcerated. She had a stroke when she was inside at the age of 37, which is very young and very hard. And so when she was 38, less than a year after she had her stroke, she was still recovering from stroke symptoms. She talked about she was still doing various exercises and still having some cognitive impairment. She was 38, she was having heavy bleeding, and she learned she had fibroid tumors, very common. Lots and lots of people in their 30s and 40s and 50s have fibroid tumors. So they recommended that she have surgery, and she went back and forth with the team because she didn't want it. She didn't want to have the surgery. And she described being told by an MTA, which I just totally forgot what that stands for, medical technical assistant, maybe, who's someone who works for the prison in a healthcare capacity, who told her, either you're going to do what he says, the doctor says, or he's not going to want to help you. So she felt like she didn't really have a choice. If she wanted to get any care or treatment, she had to follow this care plan, had to have this surgery. So she agreed. So she went to the emergency room, or, you know, went to the hospital, sorry, and you know, to get this surgery. They had her sign some papers, and then she went into surgery. And she woke up and she didn't know how long it had been, and she asked about the procedure. And she said, you know, she asked the doctor about it, and he said, and she's like, I thought you were going to take the fibroid tumors out. He said, no, you had a partial hysterectomy, which she hadn't realized beforehand that was going to happen. She thought they were going to be removing the fibroid tumors. That's what she thought they consented to, and she had a partial hysterectomy. And she described, I got depressed. You know, she's like, I didn't think Black people would get depressed if you couldn't have children. I never thought that. I thought that was a thing white people did, that we were stronger than that, which I just think is so heartbreaking and telling. And she talked about feeling depressed for a long time. She would see babies and she would feel sad, and she couldn't quite understand why, because she never received any counseling about what it would mean to have a hysterectomy, that she was ending her potential to have kids. She never talked to anybody about that. She didn't know what was going on. So fast forward, she gets out in 2012, and she goes to the doctor. She's getting physical done, dealing with her health issues, and she told the doctor she had a partial hysterectomy. And so he gave the examination, and she's like, he said, Miss, you don't have anything up there. And I said, what? He said, you don't have anything. And she said, that's when I found out they gave me a full abdominal hysterectomy. And so that was done. So she thought she was agreeing to have her fibroids removed, which she did sort of under duress. She felt like she didn't have a choice. That's what she thought she agreed to. Found out after the procedure it was a partial hysterectomy. And then found out years later she had a full hysterectomy, and she never knew, right? So I think about how does this fit into our narrative and our landscape about eugenics and sterilization? She had a sterilizing procedure. It's one that is, you know, people have fibroid tumors and get hysterectomies. It's a very, very common trajectory. It's a thing that happens. And a lot of people consent to procedures without fully understanding the implications. What is the added layer? What does it mean that this happened while she was incarcerated, and when she felt like she didn't have another choice? She couldn't seek another second opinion. She couldn't go to see another clinic or another provider. And she felt like information was deliberately kept from her in making this decision, right? And luckily now she's applied for and received compensation from the state, which we'll talk about a little bit more for this harm that happened to her. So one other story I think is quite similar, but I think gives even more context to how this happened. So this is someone Justice called her Optimus Prime. So she'd been incarcerated in state prison for less than a year. So she talked about being new in her time there. She was bleeding really heavily, 28 or 29 days a month, which, sounds awful. She too was diagnosed with fibroid tumors. And she said the only option presented to me was to get a hysterectomy. I didn't feel like I had another option because no other options were given at the time. And she talks about now, she knows, oh, I could have tried being on birth control. I could have tried, there were other things I could have tried to see if they changed my symptoms, but none of that was offered to her. She was just offered hysterectomy. And she said, it felt helpless and hopeless. And she's like, I didn't even question it at the time due to my trauma. And I thought that was so interesting. I didn't know what she meant by that. And I asked her to say more. What did her trauma have to do with anything? And she said, I was still fairly new in my time. I hadn't yet gotten the tools, or I hadn't yet taken my power back to stand up for myself. And being for me that it was another male, the doctor was a man, another male that said, no, this is what you're supposed to do, I just went with it without question. Because I didn't want to cause, to me, standing up to a male gynecologist, or just a male period at that time, if I would have said no or opposed it, it would have, in my mind, it would have resulted in violence. And that scared me because I didn't want to go through another violent episode with another man. So it just speaks to the layers here. So if we think about people who are incarcerated, estimates vary, but it's like 90 to 99% of people incarcerated in women's prisons are survivors of abuse and violence, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. It's almost universal. And we don't, is there such thing as trauma-informed care in prisons? That's another sort of topic our team's looking at, is trying to understand, because in some ways it feels very counterintuitive because prisons are so traumagenic themselves. We talked about, I think I gave one quote, someone talking about lining up like cattle. That's something people do all the time. They feel like they're really treated as animals, as less than human within this healthcare system. So the idea of sort of layering trauma-informed care on that feels very counterintuitive and difficult. But she's sort of saying that, technically, if you look on paper, someone said, offered her a hysterectomy. She agreed to it. She signed a consent form. She went to the hospital and had this procedure. She feels like she did not know that she had another choice, right? And, the states agreed that she didn't. I'm going to talk more in a second about the compensation program, but she's been compensated for being forcibly sterilized. But what's the line here? And how do we stop something like this from happening? How is it possible to make it so that people are only consenting to procedures that they want, they know the implications of, that they know the outcomes of? And how does something like being incarcerated layer on top of this when, something else that's so difficult is people are told, even if people understand or know this would limit the right to have children, if the state has already told you you're going to be incarcerated for decades, and you should not or you will not get to have kids, how does that layer on this decision making around things like sterilizing procedures? So a lot of phenomenal people have fought back against the system. So a film that came out, sorry, it looks blurry, but what year did Belly Beast come out? 2020? I feel like since the pandemic, I've lost all track of time. It was during the pandemic. I think it was 2020, but it could have been 2021. A film, Belly of the Beast, that centers on Kelly Dillon, who's pictured here, as well as an attorney, Cynthia Chandler, about the fight against this. Kelly Dillon was somebody else who unknowingly, her story, which is told in the film, she agreed to have a hysterectomy or have organs removed if they detected cancer. They didn't detect cancer, but they removed her organs anyway. So a group of people inside and outside organized to fight back. They passed a law in 2014, SB 1135. This law is sometimes known as a sunshine law because, like I said, tubal ligations already weren't supposed to be happening. It's already illegal in the state of California to do medical procedures on people without proper consent. You're not supposed to do that. But this made it even more like sort of, hey, guess what? It's illegal, don't do this. So tubal ligations after this law are not supposed to happen to anyone incarcerated in California. It cemented the procedure to make sure that any sterilizing procedures have to get approved, potentially sterilizing procedures to make sure that someone's determining it's medically necessary, and ideally that consent has happened. And this documentary, which I recommend, follows the story of fighting for this legislation as well as for fighting against the state, which has had many ups and downs. But anyway, so a lot of press was around this in 2014 when this article came out, people fighting against the law. And one thing I want to highlight is a lot of people were really okay with the fact that we were forcibly sterilizing people. These are just like random horrific comments from like Facebook about, so what, we don't need more criminals, good, the gene pool's better, sterilize prisoners, like They should be happy to get the procedure for free. The idea that this is something that was abhorrent, which is my reaction, is not universal. A lot of people think people who are incarcerated, because they are incarcerated, not knowing anything about them, what crime led them to be there, why they're there, especially because they're people of color. People are specifically calling out Black people here. They shouldn't have the right to reproduce. And that's something that really is an undercurrent here of why and how this could happen. But these amazing advocates have continued to fight, and then in 2021 passed a law to provide compensation to survivors of forced and coercive sterilization. So this includes the eugenics era, so people incarcerated, or not incarcerated, people sterilized by the state from 1909 to 1979 under the eugenics law, as well as people sterilized in prisons between 1979 and today. So this took like 4 tries to get passed. It finally did. It's currently a program that's being operated now. It was 2020, and I can't remember years, 2022 and 2023. Folks can apply if they think that they were sterilized inside a state institution. And, you know, it's been part of our research has turned into sort of following that process and watching people apply. And it's been really challenging. I think a lot of folks who've been fighting for this for years have talked about how it continues to be re-traumatizing. The state is supposed to identify people who were sterilized, but has not done that adequately, in my estimation. There hasn't been enough outreach to folks. And people have to apply, say what happened to them, tell the state, and hope the state, you know, rules in their favor in a way that's going to be quite demoralizing for people. And just to sort of, you know, this program's been going now for over a year. So what, 15 months or something like that. And in total, 384 people have applied as of the end of last month, out of, you know, 20,000 people sterilized, plus the hundreds of people who were sterilized in prison. I think they estimated that there was at least 600 people who were still alive. Obviously, if you were sterilized in 1909, you're likely no longer with us, but many people from the eugenics era. And, you know, in total, only 3 people who were sterilized in the eugenics era so far have received compensation out of 20,000, so incredibly low. And, you know, people are dying all the time is what happens. And 61 people who were sterilized inside the Department of Corrections. More people have been denied than have been approved. And it's really challenging how long the process is taking people to get approved or denied, how mysterious the process feels to a lot of people. And really just thinking about these numbers that we know in just a 6-year period, 800 people had a sterilizing procedure. And yet, you know, not even that many have applied is quite challenging. So like I said, it goes back to this sort of this iceberg, the tip of the iceberg of the tubal ligations and the people we know were sterilized during this time. But what I want to end on, or how I want to think about, is that I think it really goes beyond that even just the people who had forcible hysterectomies, and even if we count all of that together, all these sterilizing procedures, it's still in some ways the tip of the iceberg, right? So if we go back to these ideas of reproductive and family control and slavery and segregation and immigration and the residential schools, like I draw a lot on Dorothy Roberts' work, which I'm sure everybody reads Dorothy Roberts' work, but and thinking about all these systems and how all these systems work together, right? Thinking about family policing, as she calls it, child protective services, about police, about incarceration, how they have these legacies and these same systems of oppression throughout our history in the US, and are used to control families, to say who should be families, to police families. And it really, you know, thinking about incarceration specifically as a form of gendered violence, as a way, you know, a quote from one of my collaborators, she talks about not only do prisons serve to criminalize and incarcerate survivors of violence, as we talked about, almost everyone who's incarcerated is a survivor of violence, but they themselves replicate abusive conditions of power, control, isolation, and deprivation. Prisons are gender-based violence, and a really key way that they're enacted for the 200,000 women who are incarcerated in the US is through reproductive control and oppression and care. So first, just talking you know, a little bit about what we think of classically with reproduction is, you know, things like giving birth. It's still legal to shackle patients during pregnancy and labor in like half the states. It's not in California, which is great. It can be in a lot of circumstances during pregnancy, although it's not supposed to happen during labor, but if and how that's enforced is really challenging. We know that 70% of incarcerated women are parents already when they go in. I just saw an article just in the last week or so about a group of folks fighting back against inductions that are happening. It's really common that people are pressured into having inductions in order to make it easier to schedule when people are going out for births when they're incarcerated. high rates of C-sections in this population, and really high rates of adverse events during pregnancy, which is challenging. And then, of course, I think right now in this post-Dobbs world we live in, thinking about both how people inside have access to things like abortion and contraception, but also thinking about the way we criminalize people for accessing these things, which happens including in the state of California. We've had people who've been incarcerated for having miscarriages if it's thought that it was because of drug use, right? So this is a thing that happens here. It happens constantly. The way we control people's reproduction is both facilitated by incarceration and then replicated in the cycle of incarceration. I think it's important to talk about medical violence and neglect and the way that that sort of can fuel this. So we talked about, the idea of you should protect your uterus means a lot of people avoid medical care because they don't want to be in this situation where you could, something could happen to you and you're not safe. And just people describing really, really violent encounters they have with medicine. So this is someone talking about seeing someone, their stomach filled with balloon, being kicked, saying, get up, nothing's wrong with you. This idea of nothing's wrong with you comes up a lot. She died 2 hours later from a ruptured appendix. People feeling like they're being given the minimum. Again, nothing's wrong with you. Being sort of abused and degraded when you report medical care. Someone reporting being assaulted in medical and then facing retaliation for not wanting to go. So people avoid medical care or get negligent medical care, which of course has negative repercussions. A lot of people talked about pap smear day, and people talked about being lined up like cattle, all these people in a row to sort of stand up in this, take your turn in a really degrading and gross, and I won't go into it how it was detailed, but getting a pap smear and then just saying like, I'm not doing that again, right? And we know that if you don't get a pap smear, that can have negative implications if it turns out you have cancer, you have HIV that's not being treated. And then I think a big thing is family separation. So Dorothy Roberts in her book Torn Apart, I think it's in Torn Apart, she quotes someone talking about, we have family separation at the border too, in Harlem too. So we've had this, increase over the last several years of the idea of family separation and kids in cages, and which I'm incredibly glad we're drawing attention to, and I hope that we do something legitimate and real to address it. But I think it's important to highlight that when people are incarcerated, we are also preventing people from raising their children, right? So if you are incarcerated, you are away from your kids. If you are fortunate enough to have someone in your family who can care for them, that can happen. If you don't, they end up in foster care. In a lot of states, your parental rights can be automatically terminated after a certain amount of time. So if you're incarcerated for longer than that time, you automatically can lose rights to your kids. And the way that this disrupts family, not to mention things like if you are arrested and you have kids, you are heavily incentivized to plead guilty so you can go home to them, which adds to your record, makes it harder to raise your kids. And how challenging it is for people to parent behind bars to try to maintain those relationships. In a lot of states, it's incredibly expensive to call home. We just recently got free phone calls for folks in California, which is great. But just being able to call your family regularly is incredibly hard. Some states are trying to end people's ability to send mail into you. So like getting like a drawing from your kid, people are making it so it's all virtual. You can't actually get a physical thing from your child. How visits are restricted. We prevent people from raising their families, from being a part of their families when we incarcerate them, often taking them very, very far away from their homes and difficult to maintain. And so I've been interested in if and how this is an intentional feature of prisons, right? And there have been a couple interesting cases about this. So there was a case in California a couple decades ago. There was an individual who was serving a life sentence who wanted to artificially inseminate his wife, and it was rejected, saying the right to procreate is fundamentally inconsistent with incarceration. And I thought this was really interesting. They talked about the difference between the right to procreate versus the right from being free from surgical sterilization, and talked about them as being really different things. So it's sort of been established in California, at least, precedent that you shouldn't have the right to have children once you're incarcerated. That's a right that should be stripped away. And that's a big deal. That's a very fundamental human right? And so somebody wrote, James Olson, several years ago, about this idea of, is eugenics part of the work of prison? Is part of why we incarcerate people, why we have mass incarceration, to prevent people from having and raising families. And so he says, if a 3 strikes law doesn't increase deterrence and is financially unsustainable, which we pay a lot of money to incarcerate people for a long time in ways that aren't effective in any of the goals we have, right? A eugenic style policy might be one explanation. A prison sentence of 25 years to life would generally mean if the person's released, he would no longer be biologically able to have children. And he's using he pronouns here, which most people who are incarcerated are in men's prison. in this country, but this is even more pronounced and true for female-bodied people, right? If you're incarcerated from the ages of 20 to 50, the chances of you having children outside of that window are pretty slim. And so perhaps, explicitly, or especially for women and female-bodied people, prisons have this intention, this benefit, this feature, this oopsie doopsie, I don't know, but of making it so people cannot have and raise their children. And it's justified because of this new identity of criminal, right? This idea of you are now this thing. I can't say that I don't think Black people should be able to have babies. I can't say that legally, but I can say you are too dangerous to be out there having children. And so this is someone who was incarcerated talking about how and why they felt like sterilizations happened. And they said, it's all the stigma. You shouldn't be in jail. You did something wrong. You're bad for being there. So what does it matter anyway? You're already in state custody. You're a society throwaway, so we don't care. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to prevent women from the ability to get out and have babies. We're just going to handle this ourselves. We don't end up creating a further pipeline from infancy straight to prison. So people inside feel very viscerally that they are society throwaways and that they're treated as if they shouldn't have this right. And what I think is hard is that, none of this is isolated. This happens all the time, right? So in 2017, a Tennessee judge was offering reduced jail time in exchange for sterilizations. There was a lot, the ACLU said, no, don't do that, but that was the thing that was happening. People are probably familiar in 2020. Don Wooten came forward as a whistleblower, the forced sterilizations that are happening in Irwin Detention Center in Georgia, which got national attention and lawsuits related to this happening, congressional probe about what was happening, but still not an isolated case. Just 2022 December, a few months ago, there were Republicans in, oh shoot, what state was this? West Virginia? I feel like it was one of the Virginias. I didn't write it down. And now I forgot, but who looked to lessen prison time for drug users to get sterilized. And this is a quote from a legislator who said, if you're a woman, then you get your tubes tied so you don't bring any more drug babies into the system, right? And it said, while Smith acknowledged some rights, some might say his proposal was cruel and unfair and violates constitutional rights, quote unquote, he argued, until we cut the head of the snake off, we're trying to take care of the problem after the fact. So we still have this idea of this is a problem that can be solved through both incentivizing or forcibly doing this through incarceration. And I think, the biggest question, or one of the questions I get asked when I talk about this work is have the sterilization stop? Is this still happening in California? And it feels hard to imagine that it's not, but so one of the requirements after this came to light is they have to, the state has to publish a list of all the sterilizing procedures that happen. And this was from 2020, the most recent version that's up on the website. I'm trying to find out where the last 2 years are, but just to highlight a couple things. So this is someone, Black woman, had fibroids, had surgery, and had a hysterectomy, right? Says procedure wasn't intended for sterilization, but it was. And I'm like, okay, how do we know, how do we know if she consented or not? How do we know this issue of, did she want this? Did she understand what was happening? Was she given a choice? Do we have any evidence, or how do we know if that's still happening? And I think that's so present across all of healthcare in prison that we don't have a good way of knowing, which really worries me a lot, is really challenging. But then even this is a woman who had a tubal ligation. This has been the procedure that for decades the state is saying should not be happening. It was, I don't know, for some reason this report, it differentiates between Mexican and Hispanic. And I don't know if this means that Mexican is her nationality, or anyway, I don't know how they come up with these categories. So, but I'm like, okay, do we know about language concordance with getting consent? It says that she consented to the bilateral tubal ligation. But again, a lot of people consented. How do we know that for sure? And again, it says happens without the California Correctional Health Services knowledge or approval, and training is conducted on necessity for prior authorizations. So the consequence of this is the doctor, the hospital who did this need to have more training on the fact that the prior auth needs to happen from CDCR. So it becomes an insurance and a payment issue and not necessarily a rights issue. So, like I said, tip of the iceberg, we have these 144 tubal ligations, these more than 800, sterilizations that occurred in this brief period. Then we have all the sterilization procedures that are occurring inside prisons from 1979 to very much still the present. But then we also have things like forced family separation and termination of parental rights and medical neglect and medical violence and extreme sentences, all of which really prevents reproduction, right? All of which prevent people from, if we think about a reproductive justice framework, from being able to choose if they want to have kids or not, to have those kids in the way they want, to raise those kids in safety. All of that is prevented by incarceration. So if we think about this idea of 400 years of racism in America, I really think about the way we've had 400 years of reproductive oppression in America. We had slavery and other things happening during colonial times, a lot of things, where reproduction is for economic gain of others, where we had forced separation of children from their parents routinely and by design. We had the eugenics era with forced sterilizations, as well as things like segregation and other forms of medical neglect and other ways that women of color were targeted. And then we have mass incarceration. We've seen, an 8-fold increase in the number of incarcerated women between sort of 1980 and the 2010s, more than 200,000 women incarcerated. And I think an interesting statistic that Michelle Alexander talked about in the new Jim Crow is fewer Black children today are being raised by both their parents than during slavery. We've done a tremendous job of finding ways to disrupt family of people that we don't think should have the right to family. So I think a lot about reproductive oppression in prisons, about policing of family and bodies, the way incarceration creates the cycle of family separation where parents are removed and then families blamed for not having 2-parent families, which then leads to more cost to investigate, which leads to children being taken away. And so I just think about how sterilizations, took away the ability to reproduce for some, but that prisons always by design take away the ability to create and raise families. And then I just love to quote one of my collaborators in this work, Elster, who says, incarceration is a tool of reproductive suppression, and the only way around that is abolition. And I think if we care about anti-racism, we care about reproductive justice, we have to care about abolition, or we're leaving people who are most sort of marginalized and oppressed in our society to continue to have that reproductive oppression and work done on them through this feature of prisons and the work it does in our society. So, acknowledgements, and yeah, that's where I'll stop. Thanks.
Well, that was remarkable. Just such a deep dive, as well as such a broad way of being able to think through the issues. I can also, while we're starting to get going with respect to questions, we invite once again those of you who are so kind as to join us virtually to please submit your questions through the Q&A, and we will post them. But I might start with one myself. Yes. This was absolutely fascinating. You mentioned that some doctors may have performed sterilizations because of what their patients actually wanted. So I wonder, this would presuppose that there actually is effective doctor-patient communication within the prison. So how might we think about, incarcerated doctor-patient communication as another form of medical oppression, of injustice?
100%. The answer is yes, it is that. It's something that our teams looked at a lot. So in some ways, I was studying and looking at incarceration and health decision-making sort of before, outside of the reproductive health context. And so a lot of our thinking on this comes from a lot of different types of medical decision-making, and thinking about a few things. So one, I talked a little bit about trauma. People come into prisons with a lot of trauma already, which we know from lots of research impacts patient-provider communication and relationships and decision-making, and that's only magnified in this context. And then there's the really punitive nature of prisons. So a lot of people describe that even, there's really strict rules about how and when you can approach care, and things like you can only have a certain number of complaints at a time. If you try to ask more, that's something that can be, you can be punished for that, right? You're breaking a rule. When you break a rule in prison, there are severe consequences to it. It's not quite the same as like the social rules we might break when we see our doctor in the free world. And that really matters. So we've been doing some work thinking about all the ways in which prisons, the institution of prisons and jails, restrict choice that people have. And so even though patients, you can have a great doctor, who is there because they really care about patients, they want to do what's right, they want to help the patient in front of them. And because of the environment, they are structurally inhibited from doing so. There are so many things that make the patient-provider relationship restricted. You can't speak freely. You can't always ask questions. The fear of punishment, people's ability to even get to the room in the first place, like all the barriers to, the reasons people might refuse care are so magnified because often the only choice you have is to refuse care. But one story I often use, a provider in the context of this research told me she was like, doing this consultation for a birth control option. She's like, I went over all the options with the patient. I thought I was so warm and open to whatever she wanted. The patient agreed to an IUD. And then, we did it. We signed the consent. I felt great about it. The patient's changing into a gown. And it's like, so why do I have to do this? And the doctor was like, oh my gosh, she thought she had to. She didn't think she had a choice. And this is a doctor who was like, I pride myself on my rapport with my patients. I think I'm so great. How many procedures have I done where someone thought they didn't have a choice and they did? So I think both there are doctors there who are bad. I mean, Heinrich, who I quoted, I mean, that's not a good person. That's not, I don't make judgments, but I don't think he should be practicing medicine because he would talk about his patients that way. But I think there are also a lot of doctors who really want to help people. And this is a violent environment where the idea of care can be so antithetical to the space that you're in.
Fascinating. We have a question from Deborah Gordon.
Oh, Deborah.
How does the banning of abortion now intersect with this eugenic history and current framing of the cost to the state of these children?
Right? None of it makes sense. I think that's so clear, is how much of this rhetoric is so antithetical to each other and how much of it is so confusing, right? It gets to the speaking to reproductive justice rather than reproductive rights, because we both want people to not have kids, but also want people to have kids because we don't want to give them any interventions to not have kids, and that doesn't make any sense. But the ways in which I think about this are mostly that it's another way of controlling people's bodies, right? We can and will and have incarcerate or prosecute people for having miscarriages or suspected abortions, for having abortions, for seeking to end a pregnancy, which only, it's another form of reproductive control. So I really just think of them as being the same conversation. It's whether you're telling people to have kids or to not have kids or limiting their ability to do one, it's all a part of the same conversation and it all has the same outcome. So
it's a depressing moment.
It's a very depressing moment. Yeah. There's a question in the room. I don't know if we want to.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mommy.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
So I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to email you some of them. But
Please. Yeah.
the big question I have is I think that there's a lot of violence within just medicine itself and interactions, and for those of us who are not incarcerated, right? And I think people in female bodies, especially, I think that the processes, especially, what is it, 3/4 of females have fibroids, not all symptomatic. 1 out of 10 have endometriosis, with your uterine lining goes outside of the uterus. Things that are related to really, life-changing symptoms, right, that require a lot of follow-up, actually. So it's already very difficult, I think, for females to navigate the systems and all that they need and these interactions that you feel like, do you have choice or do you don't?
Yeah.
So my question, I guess, is how is it, I'm trying to think of how is it different, for the folks who are incarcerated, right? Or and so then, so and I think part of it, you're talking, there's a way that the rest of your life is approved, so that you have to be obedient the rest of your life or the consequences. So maybe that's part of it. I'm just wondering I'm not lack of information. You can't even, the whole thing, you can't get a second opinion. Supplies, just if you're bleeding for 29 out of 30 days and you have to pay for those out of commissary, it's just very, very expensive, right?
And you can get punished for hoarding extra menstrual supplies too, if you have too much. So yeah, exactly.
I just love to hear that uncertainty.
No.
Yeah. And then can I just ask, so if you have, sorry, 2 questions. The other one is there is a way in which you can, I think a lot of the procedures you're talking about, there's ways that they're suggested to all sorts of females.
Exactly.
Right? And they're not always considered, and some females jump at the opportunity, especially your penny menopause, you've had all the kids, whatever. You're just like, I need this bleeding, this pain to stop. And so if that means to get my uterus, let's do it. Can you skip to that place? Can we not do all these other things? And so I wonder if another case study might be interesting, is to look at other things that are screenings that may be related or not to female bodies. So one would be mammograms.
Yep.
And I'm curious, I think you've probably thought about all this before, and then colonoscopies, which are more generative.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I don't know if folks online can hear the question. So I'll try to repeat. The first one was sort of around like, how is this similar or different from like the fact that it can be hard for female-bodied people to access care and have their symptoms taken seriously and all of this in so many contexts, which I 100% agree with. It's something we talk about a lot. It's like, is this really different than getting care at a safety net hospital or getting care at a county institution where you don't have insurance and you don't have opportunities? And I think there's a lot that's similar, right? I think a lot of people, I mean, you know, me, like I, of course, you know, I have tons and tons of privilege. I'm a, you know, professor, blah, blah, blah. Like I've had a lot of experiences where I felt like super degraded and super uncomfortable and not had symptoms taken seriously in healthcare. So medicine is also a violent institution. Medicine is a very carceral institution, and a lot of things that come up, people tell me stories that don't always feel that similar to things that I've heard from people getting care at SF General or at UCSF, right? At all kinds of institutions. That is true. I do think that like there is things that heighten it, and there's things that are like that are different that make it more extreme. I think first of all, if you just feel like people enter into their care feeling like I'm going to be treated as less than, I don't have any autonomy, I don't have any choice. People feel that in all kinds of ways. But a lot of people, you know, I've had doctors describe this too, like patients don't ask for things because they assume, of course, they couldn't have it. They assume they will be treated negatively, where I think more people might have the assumption that they have at least a right to ask for something or to ask about their options on the outside, where I think you don't on the inside. Again, I think in a safety net setting, if you're getting care at an ER in, you know, whatever particular neighborhood or whatever type of hospital, like there's police presence, and the threat of police can serve how you engage in that setting. That is always true in incarceration. So it's something that occurs outside, but I think absolutely it occurs to a heightened degree inside. I think things like lack of privacy, like there's sort of no expectation really that privacy can be enforced because everybody talks in prisons, and also the presence of corrections either in the room or outside the room or transporting you. And then I think even things like what you have to go to get to care. So I talked a little bit about you know, you have to need to be strip searched, like the humiliating process people talk about of being driven to the hospital, being sort of taken through the back door, being in a jumpsuit and being shackled. Even like when people talk about like, you know, the 85-year-old woman at dialysis who has a 5-point shackle around, like walking in, like, you know, all of that's really, you know, just treating someone as dangerous and othered all the time, I think is really challenging. Being told not to talk to anybody, but then going to a doctor and then feeling like you can talk. Oh, thank you very much. You know, all of these things create tensions that are really challenging. And to me, I think what we've tried to articulate this on our team is really thinking through what does it mean to have autonomy in a setting where your autonomy is necessarily by design limited, and all the ways that prisons intentionally try to make you feel like you don't have a choice in a way that I think healthcare doesn't do quite as explicitly. But like you mentioned, colonoscopy. So yeah, at least in California, and this is supposed to be everywhere, I mean, you have Estelle v. Gamble, Supreme Court ruling, when you're incarcerated, you have a right to healthcare, adequate healthcare, which is of course ill-defined. And what does that mean? And the Supreme Court likes to do that with things like this. So what does that mean? But you know, you're supposed to get routine colonoscopies, you're supposed to get routine mammograms, you're supposed to get routine pap smears. They really try to encourage it because just like, you know, whatever, you know, just like your primary care doctor needs to show a certain percentage of their patients are doing it. The same thing in CDCR, they want to show that, you know, their patients are getting adequate care. So people often feel like they really are pressured into getting things like this, even if they don't want it. But someone described their experience getting a colonoscopy, you know, and it's just like things you don't even think about. Like, oh, like, you know, I've had a colonoscopy, it's unpleasant, you're drinking all this liquid, you have to go to the bathroom a lot. You're doing that in a room where you're sharing with somebody else and the toilet's out in public. Like, is that a pleasant place to go through a colonoscopy? People describe being you're in a van, you're handcuffed. They always talk about how they drive so erratically. You're getting sick, you're throwing up, or whatever else in this van, and you're being mocked or getting in trouble or being degraded for what is a really normal thing to have happen before and after any medical procedure, let alone, you know, colonoscopy that does that by design. People don't want that. So would you agree to that if you didn't have to, if it didn't feel necessary, if you didn't have an intense family history? So a lot of people avoid care like that. And I think when it comes to women's health, like these things are always hard to talk about. You don't feel like they're getting taken seriously. And we had one woman we interviewed who was not sterilized inside, but her roommate was. She was having horrible symptoms, both she and her roommate were. Her roommate got seen first, had a hysterectomy, didn't know she was having a hysterectomy, wasn't offered any hormone replacement therapy, so was having just, you know, off the walls. Like she talked about how she's like, the only time I bought drugs in prison was like trying to buy estrogen for my roommate to help get her under control what was going on. And she was like, I'm never going back and complaining about this again. And so she didn't. And then when she gets out, she goes home and she had horrific endometriosis that had taken over everything, had to have a hysterectomy when presumably like something could have been done. She might not have needed that procedure if they could have treated it effectively, but she was like, hell no, I'm not doing that. I saw what my roommate went through. So this just gets magnified, where if you had a friend who like, oh, my friend went to Kaiser and had this horrible experience, I'd be like, well, I'm not going to Kaiser, I'd go someplace else. There's nowhere else to go. You can't ask for a second opinion. You can't seek a different doctor. So I do think there are things that are unique, and yet I think a lot of it speaks to the violence of medicine. So yes and no is my short answer.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, if we don't have any other question, thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting. I was subscribed the previous time, so I was waiting for that. Yeah, of course, I think that it's so interesting to think canceration in the US as an elimination process. And it's like with that work, we're like going deeper to that idea, I think, and I really like it. As an outsider, I really think that from South Europe, I'm visiting San Quentin every week, so I have the chance to talk with those things with prisoners, especially the long sentences, which for a European is crazy. My question is about the compensation program.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think about it? If you think that that's a way to just, react a little bit, give something back, and kind of absorb the reaction.
Right. Yeah. The question.
Let me add, because we actually have one here which relates to the compensation awards program as well, from Professor Emeritus Bill Banks. Why do you think that, are there concrete data as to why the compensation awards were denied in California? So tell us a little bit more about the compensation.
Sure.
program.
Yeah, so I'll talk more about it. So yeah, like I said a little bit, there was so much fighting for this. I think it was, I can't remember if it was on the third year or the fourth year of them putting up a bill for this compensation program before it finally got passed. It was very hard fought to make it happen. And it's been so fascinating and challenging to follow the implementation of this program. So there's folks who are involved. There's a coalition of folks who've been involved, which includes, a bunch of organizations who sponsored the bill. So California Institute for Reproductive Justice, Disability Education, Disability Rights and Education Defense Fund, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, Justice Now, like all these organizations. So looking at both the eugenics era survivors, supporting folks from that era as well as modern day. As I think is always the case with policy, implementation has been a really big challenge. The vision of the program and then how it actually works have been really difficult. So it's administered by the Victims Compensation Board in California, which is an organization that usually you can turn to if you are the victim of a crime and need support. So like somebody, I'm walking down the street, I get hit by a car, and it was criminal in some way. A drunk driver hits me and I don't have insurance. Victims Compensation Board can help me get physical care or mental health care or whatever. That's sort of what they do. They also, usually their only engagement with people who've been convicted of crimes is that sometimes they're involved in going after them for restitution for crimes that they've done. So in most of their programs, you're explicitly prohibited if you also have done a crime. So if I was walking down the street, but I was jaywalking and I got hit by a car, I'm no longer entitled to work with them, right? So it's a very different population when we're talking about the eugenics era survivors, as well as people who are incarcerated than they normally work with. And I think I have this vision, like CDCR was supposed to identify people who had California Department of Corrections who had been sterilized or who potentially had a sterilizing procedure, regardless of any consent, and send them a notification so that they could apply. But California Department of Corrections has said, we don't keep medical records for that long. They've identified a fairly small number of people only in the last 10 years and said they couldn't do prior, even though there was an audit that went back prior. They're saying they don't have that anymore. It's been really hard to reach or find eugenics era survivors. And we're talking about people who were sterilized decades ago. In general, people from both people who are in prison and people who are sterilized could live anywhere in the country. How do you find these people? So the number of people applying has been much smaller than a lot of people had hoped for. Which is really disappointing. And also you have to sort of know this happened to you, which a lot of people don't. You have to be able to apply. They've sent applications in, and there have been folks in this coalition supporting people inside and applying, but it's a lot harder if you don't have the internet and you can't look things up and you don't have access to your medical records to apply. So it's really hard if you're incarcerated, or if you're 90 and you were sterilized in 1930. All of these things are really challenging, not to mention language issues. And in terms of why people have been denied, they have not said very much about it, the Victims Compensation Board. A big category that they've talked about is a lot of people have applied from the men's prisons and have not been denied, which is not a reason. It's not like that's a criteria, but that's what they've said, is that a lot of folks have applied from the men's prisons and they don't think that they qualify. If there isn't proof that you were in a certain institution, so someone, I could say I was in a state institution in 1940, but if my name's different and the name of the institution's different, I don't know the name of the institution and they can't find me, then they can't approve me to do this. And a big category has been what counts as a sterilizing procedure. So there have been a lot of people who've had endometrial ablations, which is a procedure where they don't recommend that you get pregnant. It can be either challenging to get pregnant, or if you do, you have a very high risk of miscarriage or complication. And the state is saying that doesn't count as a sterilizing procedure. So those have been some of the big buckets, but they haven't given very much specific data on it. And my overall feelings about the program, I am pro people getting money from the state, just always. So I think I'm glad people are getting something, but I do worry that, like, does this sort of let the state off the hook for what feels like very ongoing harm? It feels very weird for the state to say, we're sorry that you didn't have proper informed consent to a medical procedure, while someone is probably today not having proper informed consent for a medical procedure without enough being done to change the systems that are doing the harm.
So we have one little tiny question left from Catherine Wolf, one of our graduate students. Amazing and horrifying talk. Do you have a working definition of eugenics or a favorite source for thinking about how to define it? I struggle in my own work with the what counts and what doesn't count as eugenics.
Oh my gosh, I struggle with that too. So I agree, because no, I don't. And it's something that when I started giving versions of this talk or started thinking of this work, I was really hesitant. What are the implications of calling this eugenic? What if I say prisons are eugenic? Does that lessen, if we call everything eugenic, then nothing is eugenic, right? What are the pros and cons of sort of using the power of this word or not? And I've really gone back and forth on it. And because I don't know. And I'm in contact, and Alexandra Minna-Stern's work on sterilization and eugenics is really well known, and I like a lot of how she's talked about this. And I think she's done a really great job of exploring things like how segregation policies are eugenic, right? And I think that's important. And I think things like when we think about positive eugenics, encouraging people to have babies. I think we had conversations recently, like we've seen across the states, of how do we incentivize, what was the state that just did this thing of can lessen your property taxes up to as many children if you have 10 kids and you don't pay any property taxes, right? We find ways to incentivize certain people for having babies. Those are eugenic practices, and that doesn't mean it's bad or evil necessarily, but they are eugenic. That's the design. And I think in some ways I don't know, because I really struggle with it too, because I even think about what have I done that's been eugenic, right? I had prenatal screening when I was pregnant. That was eugenic, right? I was looking to see it, I took prenatal vitamins to prevent certain diseases. Are those eugenic practices? People have pre-implantation genetic testing. What are the ways in which that's eugenic? And how do we weigh these things in our society? And so, I really, really struggle with both wanting to say prisons are eugenic, but also being really resistant to people calling things the Holocaust that aren't, right? So I think my answer to the question is I don't have a great definition that I love, but I draw on a lot of folks' work. Alexandra Minna-Stern's work is one that I draw on quite a bit. And I think that it's important to really call out what I think is an intentional feature of prisons. I think when we make it something that's only about punishing people who are bad, we erase a lot of what's going on. And I think that allows it to flourish, because most people are for punishing people for things that are bad. But I think if we can highlight that we're also punishing people in other ways, and people who are not inherently bad, that raises important questions about what we're doing as a society.
Well, that's a wonderful statement on which to end. I want to thank, first of all, the people who are here and have asked questions, all of the wonderful people who joined us over Zoom, and most particularly our speaker.
Thank you.